Dave was my Uncle Ben, you know, 30 years ago. So
Yeah, that dates us both, Chris.
uh, it does, but you look better than I do. So, you know.
You're far too kind.
All right, Scott and Dave, whenever you're ready.
Take it away, Scott.
All right. The goal of this session is to begin to bridge everyone's thinking between Starry Night presentation and presentation of shows with ATM-4. As Nathan pointed out, you know, some of this may be a little basic for those of you who have operated shows with ATM-4 before. But a way of thinking of this is, as you've been learning your way through Starry Night, virtually all of the things that we have shown you in Starry Night can be presented live. If you wanted to, you could only have the Starry Night user interface open and present an effective show. And we have some operators who are very much live presenters with Starry Night. But the functionality of ATM-4 allows you to create visualizations in Starry Night and all of our other software suites, by the way, and turn those into timeline-based scripts so that rather than having your eyes on the user interface and making decisions moment to moment as to what you want to show on the screen, the automation timeline does 90-something% of the work for you. So the progression of our learning here goes from understanding all the deep functionality in Starry Night to using Starry Night to facilitate an automated program. And a way you can think of that is Starry Night becomes your editor. It becomes your way of making the scenes look exactly the way you want them to look, presetting everything so that when ATM-4 does take control, everything looks right. But then when you are in ATM-4 and you're running shows there, you get to take your hands entirely off the console. You can run ATM-4 from right out in the audience. Those of you who have the SciTouch interface can use that as the interface with ATM-4. So you can be far away from the console and using SciTouch to advance ATM-4. So to get this rolling, what I'd like to do is have Dave Bradstreet demonstrate one of his lessons from the Full Dome curriculum. And you'll get to see what the program looks like. And then Dave is going to pull back the curtain and show you what's happening in ATM-4. And then I'll be back to tell you about things that you can do in Starry Night to make your ATM-4 presentations better. We're not going to start training you in ATM-4, but I'd like to give you some background about how you can do little tricks and things in Starry Night to make sure that when ATM-4 calls things, it's most effective. So I'll let Dave have the microphone now.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So you should all see my render box screen.
Mhm.
And this particular lesson is brand new. Nobody's seen it before. This is a premiere. It's not too long and it's a relatively familiar topic. So what I'm going to do is run through it quickly so you can see this is all being done in ATM-4. What I would be doing normally is standing amongst my audience and clicking through the show. So this is about the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Again, I have a concentric dome, so I usually put slides up on both sides of the dome. For this particular preview suite demo, I'm going to give you the Hubble Ultra Deep Field so that you can see it well. There are approximately 10,000 galaxies in that picture. I counted them all a couple hours ago. So the question is, okay, that's very impressive, but if you don't know how big a piece of the sky that is, maybe it's not so impressive. You know, is it covering several square degrees or several arc seconds or what? And so where is this located and why did they pick that? Let me show you where they actually took the picture. Here's our buddy Orion. Everybody knows Orion. Right to his east or west, you've got Eridanus, and then little known constellation of Fornax. And Fornax is where the Hubble Ultra Deep Field was taken. And so your audience is going to think, well, what the heck? What's it doing over there? Well, the specific reason why they chose that part of the sky. First of all, it's far away from the ecliptic. If I put up ecliptic coordinates, what you see is that the Hubble Ultra Deep Field is very far away from the ecliptic, close to ecliptic poles. That was chosen because of the zodiacal light. The dust in the solar system hovers around the ecliptic plane. They don't want to be taking pictures of distant galaxies through that haze. The second reason is, you can see the Milky Way over here. They wanted to stay as far away from the Milky Way plane as they could. Here's the galactic coordinates for the Milky Way. So you can see again that the Hubble Ultra Deep Field is quite far from the haze of the galaxy, close to the South Galactic Pole. And so they picked this region because it was close to both the ecliptic pole and the galactic pole. So a nice clean part of the sky. So you want to stay away from the Milky Way because in our location, you want to look perpendicular to its disk, not along the disk where you're going to have a obscuration zone, what used to be called the zone of avoidance. So let's take a look and see if we can see how big the Hubble Ultra Deep Field is in the sky. So we're zooming in. All I'm doing to run this is I'm hitting my space bar. That's all I'm doing. So this is the embedded image of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field that's in Starry Night. You have this now. Okay, so that's impressive, but that doesn't tell me much of anything other than there's a lot of galaxies. How big is that compared to something I can compare it to that I understand and know? So let's back out to a few square degrees and let's put something up there that we do recognize. So there's the moon to scale with the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. The moon's about 31 arc minutes across. The Hubble Ultra Deep Field is about 2.4 by 2.4 arc minutes. And so the moon is more than 15 times bigger across than that. So think about how big the moon appears in the sky. Let's zoom back to the actual view of the sky. I don't know if you can see it, but my moon, this moon, I keep saying my moon like Scott. This moon is not enlarged. That's how large it actually appears in the sky. So think of a 15th of that diameter, and that's how big the ultra deep field is, tremendously small. And then just real quickly, we can use that picture to calculate the number of stars in the universe to estimate it. If we had 12.7 million of those images, that would cover the entire sky. It would actually take the Hubble a million years to do that, literally. If there's 10,000 galaxies in each image, if you multiply 10,000 times 12.7 million images, you get 127 billion galaxies. At about 100 billion stars per galaxy, that's being conservative. That would give us about 12,700 quintillion stars. To put that in context, there's about 7.5 quintillion grains of sand on the seashores of the Earth. Okay, so that's a quick and dirty mini lesson. That's going to be released eventually. So what I'd like to do now is to zip through that again and show you what was going on in ATM-4. Let me introduce you to a couple of pieces of this before I actually start it. So the ATM-4 window consists of cues, which a time bar, I'll put that up here. This is going to be running to the right, and every time it intercepts one of these cues, it'll execute what that cue tells it to do. And there are these are called tracks. You can put in as many tracks as you want, and you can label them any way you want. Usually you're using Starry Night tracks, but there's a control track that actually controls the running. And you'll see as I run this what's happening. Usually you put in a scene file to initiate everything, to set the dome up the way you want it. That's what Scott's going to talk about a little bit later. And then if I hit the space bar, when it hits these what are called pauses, it'll actually stop the show so you can talk. And then when you're ready, you hit the space bar and it just continues. And then it will trigger off these different cues. And all these different tracks, what it says, I've labeled them so you can guess immediately what each track does. It turns on slides, it turns on images, it turns on constellations, etc. So let's run it and see if we can. Okay, so what it just did was it loaded the scene. So that's what you're seeing in RenderBox. The next thing is it triggers those 2 slides. Okay, and it's for my audience, the concentric circles. That's why there's 2. And then for you guys, I put in this slide, which is a flat screen slide. Okay, large Hubble Ultra Deep Field. The S-kill just gets rid of it. And then what we're doing is these list commands just turn on the constellation, which I've already preset in the favorite to give me just the labels and the star pattern, which that's what Scott's going to talk about. As Eridanus, this will be Fornax. And now I'm going to label the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, which is a very special Q, which we'll talk about in some detail later. The ecliptic is controlled by the dim Q. And then the ecliptic grid is put on and then turned off. Then it displays the Milky Way equator. This will display the galactic grid. All I'm doing is hitting the space bar. Every time it hits a pause and stops, to make it go again, I just hit the space bar or the clicker on side touch. Now it's loading these slides of the Milky Way, drawing the perpendicular arrow. Then it draws the arrow more along the plane. Then it erases all those, puts the constellations back up. And then the zoom, I bet you'll guess what the zoom does. The zoom centers on whatever object you've centered, and I actually had the Hubble Ultra Deep Field centered in the scene. I had already preset that up. Now we're zooming back out to about 6 degrees. Now I'm turning on the moon image, slide of the moon, the same scale. And now I'm just going to turn it off and then zoom back to the full sky. And then I turned off the constellations. And then these are just slides, which are overlaying text slides that I put in. So every time it hits one of these slides, it puts in the next part. It's actually drawing one slide over another. Steve Sanders and I are going to talk about this in our intermediate ATM-4 session at 3 o'clock. And then that's all of them. And then the S-kill just says, delete all those slides and go home. So that gives you a flavor. You would not want to have to be pushing buttons and doing this live. At least I wouldn't want to, because when I'm doing things live, I like to be able to concentrate on what I'm saying in my jokes and not concentrating on the GUI and pushing this button and pushing that button. The space bar is enough for me usually. So if I've already got it all pre-programmed and ready to go, all I have to do is hit the space button or click the what am I thinking of, Scott?
Side touch?
Side touch, thank you, dear. And the show just executes as I go, and I don't have to be, I'm not locked behind the console because I like to be amongst my audience so I can kick them away. So I highly recommend, and I know Scott will say this too, ATM-4 is the way to go. If you're going to do shows that are, really snazzy and have a lot of detailed in them, ATM-4 is your best friend. Starry Night has tremendous, tremendous power, but ATM-4 is your navigator to get you to be able to use all these things and do several things simultaneously that you would not be able to do unless you've got 6 hands like Dan Zielinski. Okay. Scott, anything else you want me to say before you take over?
No, although I'm going to put you on the spot here because, there are many different styles of programming. And what I notice in your script, that script in particular, is your choice to display things like grid lines or different fields of view using ATM-4 commands for virtually everything. I think I believe you have one favorite file that's loaded at the beginning, and then throughout that script, every single thing that's added was added via ATM-4. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's the way I like to do it if I can because of Q capture, Scott. If we didn't have Q capture, then I would have probably 10 or 15 favorite files turning on the coordinate grids and so on.
Right, right.
That's the other way to do it, is to have, what you do is you set up your scene and you turn on your galactic grid, and then you save that as a favorite. So when you want to turn the grid on, you just load another favorite. So exactly right. And so that's a matter of preference.
Right. And what Dave is referring to when he says queue capture, we'll cover this later in some ATM-4 presentations, but queue capture is a feature built into ATM-4 where when you do something live, if queue capture is enabled, it will understand that you had just made a change in Starry Night, and then it will automatically drop a queue onto the timeline for you. So if you're nimble with queue capture, it's almost possible to present the entire show live and leave queue capture running, leave it open in the background, and it will, in a sense, record what you're doing. It will drop cues onto the timeline as you go. And the reason I bring that up is not to say that we should all be programming that way or even learning to do it, but like many things in Sidome, there are different ways to do them. And one of the ways to approach this too would be, rather than have one favorite file and many, many commands in ATM-4, one could also have many, many favorites files and fewer commands in ATM-4. It's entirely up to you, and you'll learn your way as you go. It just depends on your style, but there's lots of different ways to do this. In many cases, though, the way you come about creating ATM-4 based shows is to use Starry Night as your basic visualizer for anything that's going to end up on the dome. And so I want to talk a little bit about when you're setting Starry Night up to then be built upon in ATM-4, some ways that you want to think about Starry Night so that the shows that you do later are most effective. The first has to do with all of the visual options that you have in Starry Night. I think all of you, and tell you what, I should share my screen here so that as I start talking, you guys can see what I'm doing. Is everyone seeing my preview screen now? My Starry Night pre-flight?
Yes.
You are, okay. So you can see me waving my cursor around in
Yes.
pre-flight here? Okay, good. As most of you learned today, in the last couple of days, a very powerful part of Starry Night is this options pane, or this window of switches that allow you to turn visuals on and off. To remind you what options are, is virtually everything that can be drawn as a layer in Starry Night exists in the options pane. And it generally addresses large groups of objects. If we go down to the solar system, for example, and we turn off planets and moons and turn it back on again, that will be addressing all of the planets and moons in Starry Night. If we go a little further down and we turn off stars, turn them back on, what we're doing is we're turning all the stars in the sky on and off again. Another layer down into this, and Brad may or may not have covered this in your introductory training, but you'll notice with a lot of the features, a lot of the graphics that you can turn on and off, if you hover your cursor to the right of their name, you'll notice this little slider. So if I go down to the stars, for example, and I find the slider for the Milky Way, I have my Milky Way preset so that's about 1/3 of the total brightness that Starry Night can show us. So if I turn my daylight off, for example, the Milky Way is probably not extremely evident in the sky, but if I turn the Milky Way up to full brightness, it actually looks kind of ridiculously bright. And that's why by default, I have my Milky Way set to about 1/4 of the way up, about 1/3 of the way up. It looks ideal for most levels of light pollution. And this little slider is what we call a dimmer, or in ATM-4 world, a dim. And the reason I point that out is because ATM-4 can turn all of these graphics on and off, but they're categorized, and they fit into 3 categories. You'll notice that there are a few of these commands that don't have a dimmer associated with them. Daylight, for example, doesn't have a dimmer associated with it. These things that simply blink on and off that have no dimming would be what we call a toggle over in Starry Night. Or things that don't fall into big groups, like a bunch of stars or a bunch of solar system objects or whatever. We tend to call those a toggle. So the most simple things that you can turn on and off, like your daylight, your local horizon, we call that a toggle over in ATM-4. And the ones, many of the ones that do have a dimmer associated with them, if we're in ATM-4, we call that a dim queue. And then a final category over in ATM-4 are the objects that you would find under like your find screen over here, like your planets. When we want to turn an individual thing on, when we want to turn on an individual constellation, when we want to turn on an individual star, for example, or an individual planet, we will find those under what's called a list queue. So I'm going to share ATM-4 with you now. And let me just expand it so you can see. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to create a new script here. And the device that we're going to be working with throughout this presentation is the Starry Night device. You'll notice I have other devices like video control, control of the track where Dave was putting the pauses. We have volumes and soundtrack. I'm just going to be working on the Starry Night track. And the way we create queues, if we're going to make a queue, and this will all be reviewed later, by the way, but the way we place a queue on the timeline is we simply find a place that corresponds with that track, with Starry Night, and anywhere in the time of the show, 10 seconds into the show, 20 seconds into the show, we can double click in that place and it will spawn what we think of as a queue list. And this list of queues is all the things we can do in Starry Night. And you'll notice that if you look carefully at these queues, we have TOGL with the G underlined, which means that the shortcut to get to this queue is a Control G. We have a dim and we have a list. So if I am thinking about Starry Night here in the background, and I want to know what are toggle queues, what are things I can toggle, they tend to be the simple things like daylight. That will toggle on and off. If I go back to ATM-4 and I see the dim queue, that deals with those things where I can dim them up and down. And then a list queue will have many, many things that you can choose from. It will be individual constellations, individual planet names, things like that. So one of the first things to remember as you're moving from Starry Night into ATM-4 is that graphics you can turn on and off fall into those three categories. Clear so far? All right. The next thing that I want to talk about relates to how you want to set up your favorites in order to make them work properly in ATM-4. And one of the most interesting examples is when we want time flow running in our show. ATM-4, as you saw from Dave's script, can call a favorite file. It can spawn a favorite file. You'll see that favorite file appear on the dome. And if you want it to, it can have time running as part of the favorite, right? So let's say for the sake of argument that what I'm looking for is a favorite that causes the sun to rise. And the sun is going to rise in the sky until it reaches about noon. So I'm going to set my time rate here to pretty quick, right?
Hey, Scott, why is your horizon spinning?
That's a very good question, Dave. I don't know.
You're centered on Jupiter.
Let's Control Y and see if that's the case here.
I watched your pre-flight do it before.
Okay, let me just home my system and we'll make sure that's not happening. So let me take my date back to February where I was before. I'm going to take my time down to sometime near dawn. Thank you. And then I'm going to increase my rate of time flow again so that the sun is moving at kind of a nice speed in the sky. So let's pretend for the sake of argument that the first visual I want in my show is the sun moving slowly across the sky like this. I'm going to speed it up just a little bit. And I want that to start right around sunrise. So I'm going to stop time there just somewhere around sunrise, right about there. Okay. And then as time is rolling, do you guys remember that little shortcut that I have that we have for capturing a favorite? If we want to save a favorite really quickly, do you guys remember how you save a favorite very quickly and instantly? Do you guys know the Control S keyboard shortcut? Let's just say for the sake of argument, time is rolling here, and I want to make a favorite. If I hit Control S right there around the time that the sun rises, and I make a new favorite, and I call that sunrise, I now have a new favorite called sunrise, and as soon as I click on that favorite, the sun will start to rise and it'll move across the sky. In other words, every time I execute that favorite, I'm going to see time rolling, okay? Which is kind of convenient in a show if you just want to start a favorite, time rolls for you, easy breezy, right? You've got time rolling. But let's say for the sake of argument, I launch that favorite and then I realize, oh, I don't like the way my horizon looks. I would like a different horizon there. So I go into my favorite, I go into local horizons, I choose a different one, hit OK. Now I've got a problem, right? If I want to go back and save that favorite over again, I've got to do that crazy thing that I just did. I run time forward. I try to hit Control S around the time that the sun rises. I replace the favorite. And now whenever I launch that favorite, time is rolling. If that seems like an awful way to do it, it is. You know, that was a lot of work for very little result just to get the time rolling. A thing to keep in mind with ATM-4 is whenever you bring a favorite up, even if time is stopped, you'll have a simple cue in ATM-4 that says make time roll forward. So rather than trying to put the time in the favorite where every time I launch that favorite, the time starts rolling, here's a really handy trick for setting up favorites for ATM-4. If I find the spot where the sun is right on the horizon, I'm going to adjust my time kind of carefully so it looks like the sun is sitting right on the horizon. The speed, the rate of time flow that I wanted the sun to run is part of that favorite now, right? I've got it preset to 5,000, but I can now save my favorite with time stopped. And over in ATM-4, I can tell ATM-4 to roll the time forward. So this is how we typically will create favorites for automation later, is we make sure that the time that we want the favorite to run at, the actual rate of time flow, is preset in the favorite, but that we save it with time stopped so that if I ever want to go back and edit this favorite, I don't have to do that goofy thing where I stop time, roll it back, save the favorite, start time, save the favorite, right? It's much, much easier to save the favorite with time stop so that when I want to use it later, I can just create the time flow in ATM-4. So now that I'm happy with this, now that I have my time set to 5,000, but the actual rate of time flow is stopped, I can once again hit Control S, replace the favorite. And now when that favorite comes up in ATM-4, I'm ready to start time and it's all set up for the time that I want to go. So basically what we do is we try to put as many things in the favorite as possible initially that we might want to address in ATM-4. So how does all this look over in the ATM-4 world? I'll bring the program up again. Brad is going to train you all on this very carefully. He's going to go through this slowly, but I want to just generate that favorite over here in ATM-4. So what I want as the first thing in my program is that scene with time stopped, with the sun sitting on the horizon. And then at some point, I'm going to advance time and I'm going to cause the sun to rise. So we have a cue in our list called a scene, SCN. That's equivalent to a favorite file. I'm going to click on scene. It allows me to load a favorite. I think that favorite ended up in ATM-4 Tripper. Yes, it's sunrise. I click OK. Okay. So the very first thing I have in my show script here is a favorite that's going to call that scene up on the dome. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to home my system. I'm just going to get out of that favorite. And you notice that Starry Night in the background is set to whatever the last thing that I was doing. If I bring my ATM-4 script back up, rewind my show and hit play, it automatically sets my dome to that place where we're looking at the sun on the horizon in the sky, right? And then as my next step in ATM-4, if immediately what I want to have happen is time to start rolling, you'll notice down the list here, there's a cue called the time cue, and I can tell it to play the time forward at the current rate. So what I've done here is I've created a scene, and then as soon as it hits that time cue, time will begin rolling and running across the sky, okay? And the whole point of this is that in pre-flight, when I'm setting all this up, I can preset a whole bunch of things in my favorite file so that I do the least amount of work over in my ATM-4 script. Another good example of that is something called constellation auto-identify. Let's say for the sake of argument, the first scene in my show is the sun on the horizon. ATM-4 rolls it forwards for some amount of time, and the sun reaches about noon. And what I want to do now is turn the daylight off, and I'm curious about what constellations are visible in the sky, right? Starry Night will allow me to put up individual constellations or allow me to put up multiple constellations. And let's say for the sake of argument, I want to see just one constellation in the sky, right? So I'm going to set my find screen over here to constellations, okay? This allows me to choose any constellation that I want in the sky, right? But if I choose a particular constellation, something tells Starry Night that that constellation's label is showing and the stick figure is showing, right? I selected the constellation Cygnus, and something told Starry Night that when I click Cygnus, it's showing the label for Cygnus and the stick figure for Cygnus, okay? How on earth did that happen? Why did Starry Night decide that for me? If we go over to constellations here, this category of constellations, and I unminimize this little auto-identify, you'll notice that the name of the constellation and the stick figure of the constellation are the ones that are checked, right? So again, if I click Cygnus, I've told Starry Night, when I select a constellation, I want to see its name and its stick figure showing. But I have the power to change that. If I want to show the picture, the illustration that represents Cygnus, under Constellation Auto-Identify, I select illustration. And then I know that if I use ATM-4 to bring up a constellation, it will show that illustration, right? So I'm going to go back and I'm going to set this up with ATM-4 in mind. Let's say for the sake of argument, sometime later in the show, I want to go to night, for example, and I want to show a constellation. If I tell Starry Night, turn Cygnus on, for example, but I want to see its illustration, I'm going to go down to my constellation auto-identify, select illustration. And now that I have illustration selected, I can save over my favorite file again. I can hit Control S, replace my favorite file. And now I know if I select an individual constellation using ATM-4, that it's going to show the illustration. It's not going to show the name. It's not going to show the stick figure. Does that make sense? Hopefully everybody's with me.
Just to clarify, so this is because you're saying that, okay, at sunrise, only show the illustration of of a given constellation,
Yes, exactly.
and then
That's correct.
later on in the ATM timeline, you can say, okay, Cygnus, and that's how it's gonna do it.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, ATM-4 has a little more sophistication where you can tell it, show an individual constellation name, show an individual constellation stick figure. But if ATM-4 just says show Cygnus, then you know ahead of time that it's an illustration rather than a stick figure or the label or whatever. And again,
Okay.
we don't want to get too deep into the how all this is done in ATM-4. Brad and I are going to cover it later. The
Right.
point here is that when you're setting up Starry Night and you're creating favorites files, you want to be thinking ahead a little bit. What might I want to see when I turn things on and off in ATM-4? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
This strays a little bit from ATM-4, but while we're talking about options, I want to make sure that everyone understands setting their view option defaults and homing their system. This was also probably covered in the introductory course, but I don't think we can repeat often enough that when you home your system, when your system goes back to its default state, there are a whole bunch of settings visually that you may want to have by default. And I'll just give you an example. I'm going to home the system here. I'm going to expand this screen a little bit so you guys can see what I'm working on. And let's say for the sake of argument, if I turn my daylight and my horizon on, I want to look at the Altaz grid in the sky. Okay. The Altaz grid I have set here may look a bit different than the one you guys have. I have set it to look a little more dense than the default, and I've set it to be kind of this grayish white color. I just like this look. I find it kind of simple and it's nice, but I had to set this up myself. So if I want to change the conditions of my grid or any of the graphics in Starry Night, if I hover over the system, the Altaz grid system right here, if I just wave my cursor over it, you'll notice that it spawns this other color. And I'm sure all you guys have learned this so far. But if I click on it and I decide, you know what, I don't like this gray grid. I think I'd like my grid to be a little more vivid. So I'm going to pick this bright yellow color. Why did that not go to yellow? Well, that's interesting. Did I do the wrong one? That's the local equator. Sorry, guys. Let's choose the right one and go to the grid. There we go. Okay, so much more vivid, much more easy to see, right? So I have a couple of choices here. This can be my grid all the time. I can choose for this to always be a yellow grid, or I can choose to just show this yellow grid temporarily. If I only want to use these yellow grid conditions once, it's a good idea to save this as a favorite. So I'm going to use my save trick again. I'm going to hit Control S. I'm going to make a new favorite. And let's just call it yellow grid so it's easy to remember. Okay. So here's the thing to keep in mind. If I home my system, turn off my daylight and my local horizon again, and then show my Altaz grid, I'm back to the gray grid. The reason for that is I've saved those as my defaults, and my defaults always appear when I home the system. But if I want to do one particular part of my show, for example, I want ATM-4 to call up a scene where the grid looks completely different or the constellation lines are a completely different color or brightness or whatever, I can save that as a favorite file. So a way to think of your favorites files, whether you're setting them up for ATM-4 or not, is they can temporarily override your view option defaults. You can always make whatever change you want to the graphics, put that in a favorite, call up those unusual graphics without necessarily having to override your view option defaults. Again, if I home my system, which takes me back to my defaults, and I put my grid back up, that's exactly the way I want it to be permanently, okay? So let's say for the sake of argument, I've got this favorite here. It's got a nice bright yellow grid, and I decide, you know what? I think I prefer the yellow grid. I think I'll just save over my defaults. I'm just going to save over this, and I'll have a yellow grid permanently, right? So you probably learned this too. If I want the yellow grid to be there all of the time, whenever I put that grid up, I want it to be yellow. I go up to options, and then I find save current options as default. Dave, do I want to do this?
No,
I don't want to do this. I don't want to save my view option defaults right now.
no.
How come?
Because when you home the system, it's going to be dark and a yellow grid and it's a mess.
Right, let's try it. Let's see if Dave's right.
Oh God, no.
I'm going to save my view option defaults, right? And now whenever I home my system or hit the home button over here, I'm no longer looking at the sky right now from Philadelphia with a pretty daylight on and with a horizon on and with my grid turned off. I've just told it to save the defaults with daylight turned off, horizon turned off, and this grid turned on. So it's a mistake we want to be careful we don't make. We want to make sure when we set up our view option defaults that we just put everything back to the way we like it when we really home the system. Okay. So I still have a yellow grid, right? I didn't do anything to change my grid back to gray, but my yellow grid is now turned off. My daylight is on, my horizon is on, my grid is turned off. And now that I've got everything looking happy, I can now go back to options, save current options as default, and save. And now you'll notice if I turn my daylight and my horizon off and my grid on, my default grid is now the bright yellow one. So your view options are very powerful, but they're a little dangerous too. Just make sure that when you're really getting everything set up in Starry Night to look the way you want it, make sure that before you take that step of saving view option defaults, that you get everything looking exactly like you want everything to look. Are there any questions about this one specifically?
Just one question that came to my mind, Scott, is if you do overwrite your defaults, and I know you went back and you created a new default effectively, that was similar to the previous one. Starry Night doesn't have a way to restore defaults or something like that, does it?
Well, there's a really nice trick for doing that. And it's so simple that you might, smack your head and say, gee, yeah, well, we should all be doing that. I've got everything set exactly the way I want, or let's pretend I've got everything set exactly the way I want. Imagine you go through everything. You set your constellation colors the way you like them. You set every color of every grid to the way you like them. And you're very, very happy with it. And you want to make sure another operator doesn't come in and accidentally change something and then hit that save options as default. If I were to just save a favorite right now, if I hit Control S and I make a new favorite and I call that favorite like Home Scott or something like that. If I got my view option defaults all messed up, right? I changed all my grid colors, I changed all my constellation colors, and I accidentally saved those all as view option defaults, all I would have to do is hit Home Scott. It restores everything the way I like it, and then options, save current options as default, right? So you can make one favorite that's kind of a cheat, right? It could just be go back to that. And that's one of the reasons I covered the difference between temporary stuff and favorites and things you save in your default. So that's not a bad idea, everybody. If you're a little nervous, you've got a lot of operators, or they're curious and they like to go in and monkey with things, just make a favorite that's the way you like it. And then if you really get into an emergency and you need to get your way back, just click on that favorite, restore your defaults, and you're back to good again. All right, any other questions specific to what we were talking? We've got about 3 minutes, so I think we have a time for a couple more questions if anybody has any.
Scott, do you want to show them the meridian and show them they can do it in different colors?
Sure. You want the Alt-Az meridian?
Yes, please.
Okay.
No, the other meridian. I'm sorry.
You mean the
Should be
which
your local meridian.
right? Isn't that the Alt-Az, Dave?
Yeah, but how come there's no numbers on it?
That's an excellent question. I think what I did for my grid, Dave, is that I turned the labels
Oh,
up.
okay. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Right. So let's get us so we're facing south here. All right, so again, for every graphic you've got here, virtually everything that Starry Night can draw, you have the power to change things. So if I go into the Alt-Az guides, and under these guide systems, by the way, you don't have the ability to hover over the individual words like grid or meridian. You get to all of them by hovering over the whole system. If you hover over the text for Alt-Az guides and click, for local, equator, for meridian, etc. If we click on this, change it to a different color, hit OK, then we've changed it to that color. But we also have the ability to change the label font, for example. We have the ability to change the font or get rid of the labels around the dome. So everything that you can visualize on the dome, you can change to a different color or whatever.
Yeah, Scott, make the numbers yellow and the meridian green. The John Deere colors.
You said make the characters yellow?
Yeah, make those yellow.
And then you want
Make
this,
the line the green.
you want that to be green. There you go. And that's going to be very vivid on the dome.
Yeah, this the idea is that you can set it up exactly the way you want it and then save that as default. You know, everything that you use, and then you don't have to worry about it. And saving it as a favorite, Scott, that's a brilliant idea.
Just keep in mind that, again, the one thing I want to do before I save those as defaults, I can have those be the permanent settings whenever I home the system. But I want to make sure before I go into my options menu and say save current options as default, that I've put everything in my sky back to the way I want it. So if the sky looks precisely the way you want it, save current options as default, save. Now you'll notice whenever I show the meridian or the grid, it looks the way we set them up.
Yeah, except we shut the labels off.
We shut the labels off. All right. So for those of you who are just learning ATM-4, I think the next session is going to be the very basic getting started in ATM-4. In another room, Dave Bradstreet and Steve are going to be covering more advanced things in ATM-4. We're going to start pretty slow with ATM-4 instruction. So if you've had some experience with ATM-4, if you built some shows, you might find that's a little too rudimentary for you. You might not want to do the Brad and Scott session. You might want to go over to Dave and Steve and see some more interesting advanced stuff that you can do with ATM-4. All right, I think that's the end of our session. Let me get out a screen share here. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy learning ATM-4 stuff in the future.
Have
Thanks a
fun
lot.
in the castle.
Hey, Scott.
Talk to you soon.
Nice job, Scott.